Welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. You may remember from your studies the old Newtonian physics law: for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. Now that law, summarized that way, works in the realm of physics and mechanical things, but fortunately in God's providence and His mercy it doesn't work the same in our lives. In other words, for every action that we take, there are certainly reactions, but they're not always equal. And obviously sin has a fault in that, or figures into that, but in God's providence, He often softens the reaction that happens. And of course, there will be a day of judgment when justice will be complete and full. But in this life, God is using our sin for His divine purposes and our good, particularly for His people. Well, we find that then in the story of David. As you may remember, God had promised judgment against David's house, and David particularly, because of his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, and the fact that there would be a consequence to his sin. And we need to remember that lesson, that there are always consequences to sin. So we fast forward in David's life. His children are grown, and Tamar was a beautiful daughter of David. Amnon, a son of another wife, wanted her and was in love with her and took her by force and violated her. That angered David's other son, Absalom. We begin to see his character as one of impetuosity, one of boldness, and he's still pretty self-centered. Well, David is aware of this sin, and Absalom is angered by this. David is aware of all of this, and yet he doesn't do anything. And we see the failure of David to discipline his children. And they're not told all the things that happen here, but it may be supposed that Absalom, not having a heart after God, sees his father's sin and his weakness, as we often see in our parents, and decides that David's faith is hypocritical, and he holds that against David. So he plots. And after some time passes, he devises a plan in which he murders his brother Amnon. Well, that sends shockwaves through the kingdom and in David's household. There's a fear that maybe there's an open rebellion, but that's not to be just yet. And so Absalom, knowing that he's aggrieved his father, he's broken the law, flees and goes into exile. He spends some 3 years in that exile. David, after a period of time, grieves over the loss of Absalom, or his absence. And we see in David then this sentimental love for his son. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. We all love our children, even when they do bad things. But he obviously broke the law, and David was unwilling to discipline him, and yet pined for him, and wouldn't solve the problem. Finally, after some plotting by Joab, David's general, because of how this was affecting David and his kingdom, that he is convinced by Joab's plot to bring Absalom back. So David does allow him to return, but they remain estranged. Absalom's angry about this, doesn't have an audience, or doesn't have the fellowship of his father, but it's more than that. He wants attention. And he wants to be part of the kingdom, and he wants more than that, even, as we will find out. So finally, they meet, and David then restores Absalom, and then Absalom uses that restoration to begin his next plot. And his next plot is to take the kingdom from his father, and so he ingratiates himself with the people, and again remembering his rejection of David as God's anointed, the fact that he saw his father's weakness, decides to take matters into his own hands, and tells people that he would do a better job than their father, that their father really isn't just, that he doesn't really take their cases seriously. This is how he was treated by David and what happened in the household, and in his own mind he thinks he can do a better job. Well, this open rebellion then finally leads to him amassing people to take the kingdom. They get on his side, and we see the sin of Israel that follow him, and it is a well-orchestrated uprising, and so David flees. Well, what we see in David as he admits this is the effect of his sin is that he humbles himself before God and tells his people to stay and that he will go. And so he takes his personal army and flees eastward. Now, there's a lot of political intrigue, and you really should read the passage to get all that's happening with the corresponding parts and all that's happening within the storyline about the advisors of David and those who kind of play both sides and all. And what God is doing, of course, is bringing the plot and the plan of Absalom to nothing. In the end, after all this intrigue, Absalom and his men are defeated, and he is even killed. And we see again in David this love for his son. And it reminds us of God's love for his own people and those who reject him. I mean, I'm sure that God, as we're told, has created all human beings. He loved the world. He sent his son. And he does not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. But God's love is not just mere sentimentality. It is not just an emotional attachment. And of course, that's where David then fails to be the Christ, the picture of the true Christ. He gives over to his sentimental love, and it affects again his kingship. Joab sees it, warns David about it, and so David then returns back to Jerusalem, and he appeals to his own tribe and says, why not bring me back as king? And of course now we have party loyalty, and so they do. The rest of Israel is upset because of this bitter infighting between the tribes and Judah, and they come and bring David back. But again, the intrigue happens, and so what we finally end up with is that there is a rebellion again, and David's kingdom is threatened again by a Benjamite, that is, Sheba, who's from the same tribe of Saul, and perhaps that's a connection, being reminded that David had replaced Saul. He says, we shouldn't have David as king, and so there's an open rebellion of many people against David's kingship. In the midst of all this, Joab's position as general is threatened because David is tired of Joab's machinations, and Joab secures his position by killing his rival. And all these things are happening, and we see the sin of people and all that's going on, and we wonder about justice and truth and all these kinds of things. And yet God is using this. He's using this to reveal the sinfulness of men, the failure of David as a man, that he's not the Christ, that there is one who would be truthful and faithful in the end. Well, the end of all the story is that Sheba's rebellion is put down, and he is killed, and there's peace again, and David is fully restored as the king of God's people. But things are fractured. Sin has its effects. The tribes are behind David because, well, David's been the one that's defeated their enemies, but it wouldn't take much for them to reject the Davidic line, as we will see later down the road. And we see not only their sin and their willingness to reject God's anointed, it reveals our own hearts, how we reject God's anointed. And we see all these things that involve David's weakness, the people's sins, and yet God is gracious. God returns David, and the promise of God remains the same. There will be his descendant who will lead us to Christ. And all this points us forward to Jesus who would come. Jesus, who would be the one who would administer justice rightly, fairly, evenly. Jesus, who will love us with a love that will never pass away, but not a mere sentimental emotionalism, but a love based on the purposes, the promises, and the work of God in our hearts to change us into a new people. Indeed, we long for that kingdom. We long for the rule. And even in our day of governments and elections, what we want and what we need is righteousness and justice, but a love that carries us forward, a love that enables us to love. Well, all that is in the gospel. All that is why Jesus came. And that's good news. Good night.